The Galactic Empire had expanded for millennia, absorbing countless species with ease, never once meeting a challenge they could not crush beneath their fleets until they encountered Earth, a planet spinning quietly in the spiral arm of a backwater galaxy, with no known warp gates, no planetary defenses, and no significant cultural exports. Its dominant species classified as primitive, post-industrial at best, and yet curious in ways that intrigued the lower echelons of the Empire's intelligence courts, who often sent junior analysts to observe for training purposes. The early reports were routine, noting a chaotic political structure and vast inequality among human populations, but no signs of unified space travel or planetary cohesion. Their media was saturated with fiction, their science was scattered and redundant, and their culture often seemed obsessed with conflict and death, but not in any productive or ritualistic manner, just violence for the sake of story, for the sake of pride, for the sake of memory. Still, protocol required initial contact to be made peacefully, so a probe was dispatched to enter orbit and broadcast standard greetings. The probe was destroyed within 6 hours, and the signal was never recovered. No weapons were recorded, no energy readings were detected, only a visual fragment sent moments before destruction, showing a streak of light and a sonic rupture, then silence. The Empire sent another probe, this one cloaked and equipped with enhanced countermeasures. It too vanished without a trace. At first, the loss was dismissed as technical failure or atmospheric anomaly, but patterns emerged too quickly to ignore. Other scouting probes launched toward Earth from different vectors also went dark, and orbital sensors detected faint anomalies, suggesting counter-surveillance measures far more advanced than any documented human technology. The decision was made to send an exploration team staffed with exo-diplomats and low-risk security personnel. The transport vessel emerged from hyperspace on the edge of the Sol system and began its slow approach, still under the assumption that Earth posed no threat and perhaps offered new genetic or cultural material for assimilation. What they did not know, and what the Empire would fail to grasp until too late, was that the humans had seen them first, not just through telescopes or digital data, but through stories and ideas. And long before the first Imperial probe crossed their path, the people of Earth had already imagined the Empire and imagined how to defeat it. Earth was small, isolated, and unimpressive to the Imperial census, yet the scouting ships vanished and probes went dark, leaving only garbled signals of chaos and fire. The transmission logs were brief, disjointed, filled with static and odd human voices, speaking rapidly in multiple dialects, some shouting, some laughing, others issuing commands in calm tones. None of it made sense to the linguistic AI, which flagged the recordings as corrupted or encoded, but there were no encryption patterns, just raw emotion and background noise. The first manned Imperial vessel to enter low Earth orbit detected strange emissions from every corner of the planet, not just from cities or military installations, but from houses, schools, farms, even floating platforms in the oceans, all of them broadcasting digital waves packed with cultural artifacts and electromagnetic pulses, many mimicking known surveillance frequencies, others creating false echoes across the spectrum. When the team deployed to the surface using standard diplomatic protocols, they were met not with resistance, but with hospitality. Humans came forward, smiling, curious, and friendly, offering food, drink, and conversation. They asked questions about the Empire, about its mission, and the vastness of the galaxy. They acted like explorers themselves, eager to learn, eager to share, and never once did they show fear. The Empire assumed compliance, as it always did, and began deploying integration stations disguised as embassies and trade hubs. But the humans never truly engaged. They came in waves, each different from the last. Soldiers who did not look like soldiers, engineers who claimed to be artists, farmers who discussed orbital mechanics with casual fluency. Even the children were strange, showing signs of independent thought patterns the Empire typically found only in mature minds capable of subversion and analysis. Something was wrong, and a few within the Empire saw it too late. A science officer reviewing centuries of human digital media found records of wars fought on scales the Empire could barely understand, entire continents consumed by fire, skies darkened for years, and still they survived, still they rebuilt again and again. Earth was not primitive, Earth was patient. The scouting ships were not destroyed by defense grids, they were disassembled, studied, and then used the wreckage scattered in patterns that mimicked natural decay, fooling the sensors of any who followed. What the Empire could not see through their arrogance was that Earth had never stopped preparing, and they had never needed to reach the stars, because they knew the stars would come to them. When the Empire sent a diplomatic envoy expecting obedience, they were greeted by silence until the shuttles landed and the humans emerged looking like any other sentient race. But moving with a strange confidence, they carried no weapons, wore no armor, and showed no fear even as Imperial guards in gleaming alloy plating formed a perimeter around the landing site. The human officials walked with hands in plain view, expressions calm yet alert, as if they were not meeting an interstellar power for the first time, but rather assessing a known variable, weighing strengths, weaknesses, intent. They offered greetings in perfect Imperial standard, though their accents carried the unpredictable tones of a species that had mastered not one language, but thousands, and their expressions held layers of meaning that did not match their words. They bowed slightly, but only once. They extended hands in a gesture the translators could not interpret as formal or submissive. It was merely human, and that made it dangerous, because everything about them was designed to be dismissed. The lead diplomat, a woman whose age could not be easily guessed, met the Imperial prefect with a smile and a question not about trade or governance, or even technology, but about music, specifically if the prefect enjoyed dissonance. And before the question could be processed or translated, she produced a small device and played a series of tones that made the Imperial auditory systems glitch for a fraction of a second, a test, subtle and bold all at once. The Empire had protocols for hostile or deceptive contacts, but the humans broke none of them. They complied with every request, handed over biological samples, shared cultural data, submitted to scans, but something was missing. They offered no resistance because they offered no threat. But the Imperial analysts grew uneasy. For every piece of data offered, there was a shadow, an absence, a gap where something should have been. The humans knew more than they showed, and less than they claimed, a contradiction wrapped in politeness. Their cities were built with layers of redundancy, their networks decentralized, their population taught to adapt to chaos as if instability was not a flaw, but a design philosophy, and every human, no matter how insignificant, seemed to possess knowledge in fields far beyond their declared station. The Empire had studied obedience, had engineered it into species for generations, but they had never encountered a race that had learned to weaponize the appearance of submission. Humans were weaker than Rothi, slower than Elkin, less psychic than Drell, but there was something else in them, something honed, not bred, something cultivated through generations of struggle, not against predators or alien threats, but against each other, and against the very world they were born into. They were not shaped by evolution in the traditional sense. They were shaped by their own choices, their mistakes, their wars, their endless pursuit of more. The Empire measured strength by biology, by telepathy, by endurance and combatability, but humans passed those tests only marginally. What the metrics did not capture was intent, was creativity under pressure, was the raw ability to improvise and adapt, not over centuries but in seconds. Humans trained not only soldiers but civilians in scenarios where survival depended on instinct and quick thinking. They built simulations, they gamified strategy, they turned suffering into stories, and taught their young how to think like survivors long before they knew what survival meant. The first signs became clear when the Empire attempted to install monitoring nodes across human infrastructure, expecting to co-opt communication networks and data centers. But those systems were not centralized. They were layered with backups, with false pathways, with code that rewrote itself in response to intrusion, and all of it designed by people who expected the worst from their fellow humans. The Empire saw paranoia but missed the truth. It was preparation. Even in casual conversation, human minds moved in unexpected ways. They drew connections between unrelated topics. They cracked encrypted messages with cultural references. They joked during tense moments, not out of ignorance, but because humor for them was a tool, not a weakness. When an Imperial officer mocked a human technician for lacking neural enhancements, the technician responded by rerouting a power grid with nothing but a handheld interface and a pen, drawing calculations on a napkin and solving a problem the Empire had spent a decade failing to understand. And there was the problem. Humans did not win by being better, they won by being impossible to predict, by caring about things the Empire considered irrelevant, by valuing stories and art and irrational acts of kindness alongside cold logic and ruthless efficiency. They could be teachers or killers, poets or engineers, and often they were all these things at once, and the Empire had no category for such a species, no box to place them in, no protocol to contain what did not conform. They had learned war not from evolution, but from necessity, from fighting each other for centuries in ways that defied logic, and followed instinct, from building machines to destroy and then building better ones to stop that destruction. They learned through pain, through collapse, through failure, and never once did they stop moving forward. They recorded their wars in books and films, and simulations, dissected tactics, glorified heroes, analyzed mistakes, and taught children the patterns of history not to repeat but to understand. Where the Empire engineered peace through dominance, humans engineered peace through deterrence, by convincing each other that the cost of war was unbearable, yet somehow inevitable. They created entire schools of thought around how to win without fighting, how to use deception, diplomacy, and timing as weapons. And when war came, they adapted with terrifying speed. Generals rose and fell in weak, strategies changed overnight, technologies meant for commerce were refitted into weapons, and soldiers were trained not just to follow orders, but to think independently, to improvise, to defy expectations if it meant survival. The Empire did not understand asymmetry. They understood front lines and formations. They understood psychological warfare from the top down. But humans did not always attack from the top. They struck from the sides, from beneath, from within. They used information like knives. They used chaos like fuel. And they never stayed in one place long enough to be categorized. They played games where they pretended to be soldiers for training, and for sport they simulated global conflict for entertainment, and from that grew generations of tacticians who could model a battlefield in their heads and break it into fragments that others could never see. When the Empire encountered the first resistance cells on Earth, they assumed rebellion and prepared for suppression. But the cells were already gone. The humans had used the very infrastructure the Empire built to coordinate movement, to redirect supplies, to spread disinformation in languages the Empire thought were extinct. They repurposed everything. Every imperial device became a tool, every surveillance drone a messenger, every security measure a puzzle waiting to be reprogrammed and turned against its creators. The Empire had prepared for armies and for fleets, but they had not prepared for a people who had spent centuries turning survival into an art form, who had spent lifetimes imagining every kind of invader and every way to bring them down. The Empire underestimated their cunning as humans infiltrated systems, blended into colonies, and spoke the common tongue without accent, working as mechanics, traders, even minor bureaucrats. They filed reports, they fixed equipment, they delivered food, and no one questioned them because they were too ordinary, too polite, too unimportant to notice. And that was exactly what made them dangerous. They did not arrive in fleets, they arrived in singles and pairs, with forged documents and convincing smiles, bringing gifts from Earth and offering to help rebuild what the Empire itself had broken. They studied every system, every policy, every weakness, not from above, but from within. They sat beside imperial officers in mess halls, laughed at their jokes, and learned their routines. They repaired ships and installed updates, and in the process created backdoors and overrides that no one detected because no one suspected the smiling human who never raised their voice and always arrived on time. Some worked in maintenance, where they were routed emergency protocols to cause delays. In others, humans handled logistics, quietly reshaping the movement of supplies until entire regiments found themselves short of fuel, food, and ammunition at the worst possible moments. But what unsettled the Empire most were the human whispers in the dark corridors of its cities, the rumors spreading through once obedient populations that there was another way, that the Empire was not eternal, that it could fall, and that those who helped the humans would be remembered when it did. The humans did not force rebellion, they inspired it with carefully chosen words and precise acts of defiance, small things at first barely noticed until they added up to something undeniable, and the Empire found itself chasing ghosts, people who never seemed to be in the same place twice, people who left behind strange messages or jokes, or scraps of ancient Earth literature scrawled on walls in forgotten dialects. Entire sectors became unreliable, entire planets slowed in their production, entire chains of command began to doubt each other because the humans had embedded uncertainty like a virus. And still they smiled, still they blended, still they helped with repairs and data transfers and interspecies diplomacy, while setting the stage for something far larger than the Empire could imagine. They had become part of the machine, only to slowly dismantle it from the inside with hands that never once appeared to hold a weapon. Then came the flashpoints, sudden strikes on key Imperial nodes that disabled fleets overnight, while ground forces found their weapons sabotaged by the very humans they had employed at first. It was nothing more than minor incidents, systems failures, a malfunction here, a slight delay there, the kind of things every large operation faced and easily dismissed, but soon it escalated with entire fleets crippled by coordinated hacks that seemed to come from nowhere, no clear origin, no discernible pattern. At first, the Empire assumed these were anomalies, not attacks, just accidents or routine failures. But then something changed. Entire communications arrays went down without warning. Planetary defenses fell apart in seconds, and automated factories turned against their masters, producing faulty war machines that broke down mid-battle before they could even be deployed. What made it worse was the fact that no one knew where the humans were hiding, how they were orchestrating such precise operations against targets across the galaxy. They didn't have ships large enough to carry out such widespread sabotage. They didn't have the resources of a full-scale military. But what they did have was an understanding of their enemies' weaknesses, better than the Empire could ever grasp. The humans understood that there was no need for direct confrontation against the Empire's vast armadas. They didn't need to fight the battle on the Empire's terms. They had learned the art of asymmetry. They had learned how to use small gestures to topple giants, to strike at the foundation and let the rest crumble on its own. So they targeted weak points, isolated systems, and overlooked technology that the Empire took for granted, places where a single failure could trigger a chain reaction of destruction. And they did it all in the dark, hidden in plain sight, moving like shadows across the Empire's vast infrastructure. Imperial officers scrambled to respond, sending teams to investigate the breakdowns, but each time they arrived, the trail had already gone cold. The humans had already moved on, leaving behind nothing but chaos in their wake. And when an Imperial fleet finally tracked a group of human operatives to a remote planet, they found it abandoned, not a single human left alive, and no sign of how they had managed to escape without a trace. The humans were everywhere and nowhere at once. They were hidden in plain sight, and they were unstoppable. By the time the Empire understood it was not facing a rebellion, but an invasion, the humans had already taken control of communication, erased seized shipyards, and rallied other oppressed species. With promises of liberation, the Empire's arrogance had blinded them to the true scope of the threat. They had been so focused on the idea of human weakness that they failed to see what lay beneath the surface. They had underestimated a species that had turned survival into an art form and made revolution a game they could win. The humans did not fight like the other species the Empire had crushed before. They did not rise up in rage or desperation. They rose with purpose, with strategy, and with the knowledge that they could break the Empire from within piece by piece until nothing was left standing. They had built a network of allies from every corner of the galaxy, oppressed peoples who had long been subjugated by Imperial rule, those who had been promised freedom but never received it, those who had been forgotten by history and buried under the weight of Empire's dominance. Humans spoke to them in whispers and encrypted messages passed through ancient trade routes and coded signals that no one could decipher, and in doing so they convinced entire worlds to rebel against their imperial overlords. They promised them freedom and equality, but most of all they promised them a chance to be something more than tools for an empire that had used them for centuries without ever considering their worth. And so the rebellion spread across the galaxy, not with the force of an army, but with the spread of an idea. The Empire's once unified territories fractured into warring factions as human propaganda spread like wildfire among those who had suffered for so long under Imperial rule. The Empire was not facing an enemy they could defeat with guns or ships or psychic prowess. They were facing a movement that had been decades in the making, a movement that understood how to use the Empire's own tools against it, how to turn their arrogance into a weakness and their overconfidence into a liability. It was too late to stop it, and the Empire knew it. They had no idea how to fight back against an enemy who didn't need to fight to win. In the end, the Empire fell not to superior firepower or numbers, but to the one thing they never accounted for: soldiers who did not look like soldiers, who walked among them, smiled, served, and waited until the time was right to strike. There was no grand battle, no final stand, no sweeping clash of fleets across the stars. Instead, the Empire simply stopped working. Systems failed, governors disappeared, fleets received no orders, and when they did, the orders contradicted themselves. Entire sectors went dark, not because they were destroyed, but because they chose silence over loyalty. They listened to the human operatives who had once worked in their mines, their hospitals, their markets, and realized the Empire had never cared for them and never would. The humans had learned patience from their long and brutal history. They had learned how to disappear, how to become part of the background, and how to speak just enough truth to plant seeds of doubt in even the most loyal servants of the Empire. And once doubt took root, the collapse was inevitable. It was not a war, it was an unraveling. One by one, the Imperial admirals surrendered or vanished. Some joined the human coalition, others simply walked away from their posts, unable to reconcile the truth that a species dismissed as primitive had broken an empire without ever showing their full strength. And through it all, the humans remained calm. They did not gloat or celebrate. They simply began building something new, something different with the allies they had gathered, with the trust they had earned not through fear, but through sacrifice and effort and persistence. The archives would later show that the first act of the resistance was not sabotage or infiltration, but a question whispered by a human in a forgotten trade station to an alien janitor who had once been a soldier: "Do you think they would notice if we just stopped obeying?" And from that one question, an entire galaxy began to change. The humans had no special powers, no grand technology, no divine guidance, only the ability to look at a system and see how it might be undone, and the will to act on that knowledge, no matter how long it took. They blended in until the day they no longer had to. And by then, the Empire was already gone.